Pass you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Stephen, for a powerful introduction. Um, Firstly, just to say, oh, good catch, Rabbi. Very good. Very good. What way to start. Firstly, just to say, I have my laptop here, but didn't want to have two laptops. So I'm reading my certain things off my phone. I'm not WhatsApping during this talk, just in case that looks really rude. I want to talk. I want to just focus on a particular pasuk to start with, and we'll see why. The line that kind of caught my eye when looking through this week's parsha, we say, "Machshepa lo techayeh," you shall not permit a sorceress to live. You shall not permit a sorceress to live. And this really sort of caught my eye, it caught my attention. It was something I wanted to talk about today for a couple of reasons. The first of which is that in my house, there was a very, very dangerous precedent that was set early on in my marriage, which was as soon as we got married, my wife is a big fan of Harry Potter. And she says to me, "You have to read Harry Potter. It's amazing. You'll love it." And the very dangerous precedent was set because she was 100% right. I did read it and I did love it. And it started our marriage off with her being 100% right. And basically, that's how things have gone ever since. So I've become a very big fan of Harry Potter, and therefore, anytime sorcery or magic or anything of that sort is mentioned, immediately a light bulb goes off in my head, and I want to delve into it. So that's the first reason this kind of drew my attention. The second reason is because I think it really leads itself to kind of two. Okay, I think it really leads itself to sort of two big questions that we have immediately when we see this idea about a sorceress not being permitted to live. The first question, which is really the most important, the most fundamental, the most basic, is this notion of what does it mean by sorcery? What do we mean when we talk about sorcery? And really, what we're asking is, what is the Jewish belief about magic, about the occult, about the sort of notion of a sort of supernatural entities outside the realm of what we already believe about kind of divine, outside the realm we kind of believe about the sort of divine ideas that we already know about Hashem's power, about Malachim. How do we understand this kind of idea of sorcery and magic? How do we internalize that? What's the Jewish belief of that? And then linked to that, we have a question of why is sorcery so bad that it warrants us not to allow the sorceress to live? Why is it such a problematic entity? And originally, my plan was that that was entirely what I was going to speak about today. And I was going to prepare a kind of source sheet going backwards and forwards on all the sort of different major views of the Rishonim about how we view magic and how we're supposed to understand and how we're supposed to sort of comprehend this idea of sorcery and of magic. I decided not to do that for a couple of reasons. We are going to talk about magic. We are going to talk about how we understand this. But the problem is that there's sort of, and we'll delve into this in more detail, there's two main schools of thought as to how we understand sorcery and magic. And there's no real way to reconcile it. You either believe in one school of thought or the other. And I thought for this hush of a gathering at this time in the morning, we need something a bit more solid and something a bit more satisfactory than just there's this thought and there's this thought and decide yourself. So we will talk about schools of thought, but I wanted to add some more to it as well. The second reason that I wanted to broaden this is because when looking at this verse, looking at the context of what we're talking about, looking at the context of where the Torah brings this and what we go on to say within this passage in the Parsha, I think we have further questions to ask. There's a really interesting, bizarre, poignant passage that comes about in our Parsha. And I'm just going to read through, I'll just read through it in English because we'll sort of see immediately that actually it's a bit bizarre. There seems to be a lot of ideas thrown at us, and we're going to kind of just have a quick look and try and understand what's going on with this. So we start off with just, this is in chapter 22, verse 15. It says, if a man shall seduce a virgin who is not betrothed and lie with her, he shall provide her with a marriage contract as his wife. If her father refuses to give her to him, he shall weigh out silver according to the marriage contract. Okay, that's the first thing. We then move straight on. You shall not permit a sorceress to live. Anyone who lies with an animal shall surely be put to death. One who brings offering to other gods shall be destroyed, only to Hashem alone. And then we get to the next part, which is in many ways the core part of our parasha. It's right in the middle of our Parsha, as if to say, you know, our whole Sedra this week is about informing us how to build a society. This is bang in the middle, as if to say, this is the core point, this is the key idea. And it says, you shall not taunt or oppress a stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You shall not cause pain to any widow or orphan. If you dare cause him pain, for he shall cry out to me, I shall surely hear his outcry. My wrath shall blaze, and I shall kill you by the sword, and your wives will be widows, and your children orphans. Okay? We have a number of questions to sort of answer, or to ask rather, on this passage. The first question we had is our original question, going back to sorcery. What is sorcery? What is magic? How do we believe in magic? What do we believe about magic and about sorcery and about all of these ideas? The second question, I think, as we mentioned, is that this passage seems really quite arbitrary and sporadic. You seem to be taking lots of different ideas, okay, all important ideas, all important halachot, but you seem to be taking lots of different ideas that appear unconnected and putting them together. And then we eventually get to the kind of second part of this, which is this fundamental idea of do not oppress the stranger, do look after the widow and the orphan, look after them. So we have this kind of these two things, these random, seemingly random halachot, leading into this overall broad idea of not oppressing the stranger, looking after the widow and the orphan. How do all of those things link together? How do those halachot link together? How do they then, as a group, go forward into this notion of looking after the stranger, not oppressing the stranger? Why is those two ideas juxtaposed with each other? And the third question we have on this is we have this famous idea which is brought again and again and again throughout the rest of the Torah, which is you shall not oppress the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. This is very problematic because it's almost as if saying, well, you were strangers in the land of Egypt, therefore you should not oppress a stranger, as if to say, you know, look at the Egyptians and how well they looked after you. You should do that to other, like holding them up like some example, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt, therefore don't oppress a stranger. Doesn't seem to quite fit in with what we know our experience was in Egypt. I imagine if we left an Airbnb review, it wouldn't be very good of our time in Mitzrayim. We were heavily mistreated, oppressed, killed. So why are we holding them up some example to follow? These are the kind of questions that I want to look at in our remaining minutes this morning. So the first, going back to our first original question of what is magic and how do we understand magic, there's, as I said, there's sort of primarily two schools of thought. And the way I like to kind of think about them, conceptualize them, although there are many other commentators involved, is the Rambam school of thought and the Ramban school of thought, because that one letter at the end makes a huge difference in the philosophy of how we view things. Okay, the Rambam, Maimonides, and Nachmanides have diametrically opposing views on this particular subject, which actually stem from their views on how they kind of view nature as a whole. And as a very short summary of this, Ramban, Nachmanides, is very much of the belief that the entire world is governed by it purely and only by the sort of Ratzon Hashem, by the will of Hashem, by the spiritual forces created by Hashem. And that's kind of how the world works. What he means by that, and Rav Eliyahu Dessler, Mitav Eliyahu, kind of brings this in the clearest way, is that when we talk about forces like gravity or sort of concepts of science, nature, those are kind of illusions. They exist, but really it's only what Hashem wants. It's the Ratzon Hashem. There's no point sort of delving into it any further. So in a sort of simplistic way, if you ask the Ramban, when I drop this spoon, why does it fall? His answer is, because that's what Hashem wants. Nothing, you know, gravity, yes, that's what we can call it, and that's what happens every time, but it's the Ratzon Hashem. That's how he understands it. If Hashem wanted right now for the spoon to fly up, would have been cool if that happened, it didn't, but there we go. If Hashem wanted the spoon to fly up, then that's exactly what would happen, because it's all down to the Ratzon Hashem and what Hashem wants. Rambam, Maimonides, sort of had a different view to pretty much everyone who went before him, and he kind of, I guess, invented or discovered or was the real father of this idea of sort of a rationalistic model of how we view the world. And he says, no, Hashem created a world in which there are all these forces, scientific rules, the laws of gravity, the laws of maths, the laws of physics, all of these things which we can study, which we can comprehend, which we can understand. And Hashem does not contravene those, even though he can. Hashem does not contravene those ideas. It's a world that was created with systems in place that we can study, comprehend, understand. That's the Rambam's view. And that ties in to how they understand magic. according to the Ramban, according to Nachmanides, there are all sorts of sort of spiritual forces. There are all sorts of forces in the world. And the Ramban says what magic effectively is sort of utilizing these forces in a negative way, particularly utilizing sort of demonic forces, utilizing demonic ideas in order to bring this sort of dark utilage of nature and of spiritual energy to bend it to your will to make things happen that are above and beyond the natural. And Ramban says there are such people in the world who are able to do that, who are able to utilize the forces, who are able to twist nature in their way, i.e., it really exists. Magic really exists. It's a real entity. There are really people who can do magic. Rabbi Shisley. Okay. All right. So, Rambam, however, says the opposite. And I'll actually read you what he says because it's pretty. Rambam is not one to leave people in any doubt of what he believes. And he says, regarding talking about magic and talking about all of these ideas, all of the above matters are falsehood and lies with which the original idolaters deceived the Gentile nations in order to lead them after them. It is not fitting for the Jews who are wise sages to be drawn into such emptiness, nor to consider that they have values. And then he goes on to say, whoever believes in these things, in the occult arts of the nature, and in his heart thinks they are true and words of wisdom, but are forbidden by the Torah, is foolish and feeble-minded. Right? The Rambam says in no uncertain terms that such things do not exist. They are all sleight of hand. They're all trickery. They will all be the sort of magic that we know nowadays. We can see great magicians in the world nowadays, and they do things that are unbelievable, and you think, how could they do that? But we know it's practice, it's sleight of hand, it's all these things. It's not actual real twisting of nature in some way. Those are by and large the kind of two ways to understand what magic is. But we come back to our next questions of how does this link in with all the other halachot we learn here? And how do those halachot in turn link in with this idea of being kind to the stranger because you were strangers in the land of Egypt? And in order to sort of understand that, we have to look at this idea. What does it mean because you were strangers in the land of Egypt? How do we sort of understand that? And I think the answer very simply is that we know that we have the obligation to look after the strangers in our midst because we know what it is to be oppressed. This is a fact of our history. We know what it is to be oppressed. We know what it is to be a stranger, to be vulnerable, to have people above us oppressing us. Therefore, whenever we see someone in that situation, our natural instinct should be to help them, should be to stick up for that person, should be the complete opposite of oppressing them in any way, because we know what it feels like. And that's the truth of our history, stemming from Mitzrayim, but all the way through our history, we know what it is. And in fact, it's very sort of pertinent that we were forged as a nation in the sort of crucible of the hardship, the pain, the suffering of Egypt. That's how we were formed as a nation, because we should be a nation in the image of Abraham, who famously was all about chesed, welcoming people in. And in order to ensure that we were those people, that we had, we merited to continue those traits, we had to be forged in hard circumstances so that we would never let another suffer and not care about it. That's why we had to go through it. So it's not holding Egypt up as some sort of example. It's saying, you know what it is to be oppressed, and therefore ensure it doesn't happen to anyone else. So we still have this question then, how do all these things tie together? How does sorcery and all of the other things we talked about, all the other halachot, tied together with this idea of not oppressing the stranger in our midst? And I think the answer is very powerful, which is, if we think about the people who are mentioned here, the stranger, the widow, the orphan, these are the people who are the most vulnerable in society. What this is talking about is, do not oppress the vulnerable in society. Do not oppress the vulnerable in society. Do not turn from the vulnerable in society. And the fact that this idea is then juxtaposed with all these halachot teaches us an even further message, which is what happens if you do? What happens if you do ignore the needs of the vulnerable in society? What happens if you do oppress them or ignore them or negate them? They will turn to external forces in order to find some sort of comfort or some sort of hope, because you have let them down. So what happens? They turn to idolatry. They turn to the sorcerer, whether the sorcerer is the Ramban idea, someone who can actually twist nature, or the Rambam idea, someone who's effectively tricking vulnerable people into believing that they have some sort of power that they don't have. They turn to all these external dark forces that are outside of our faith, outside of what we believe should be the way a person should live, because we have let them down, because we have not looked after them, because as a society, as a community, we have failed in that task. And I think that's an immensely powerful and poignant message for us all to take on, that we have this collective responsibility to look after everyone in our community. But it starts, of course, with those most vulnerable, with those most in need. Because if we don't, not only have we vagrantly sort of ignored Torah law, but we lead to more desecration coming. We lead to people turning to external forces. The forces nowadays perhaps are a little bit different, not necessarily sort of sorcery and idolatry, but other sort of dark forces in the world, addiction, whatever else it might be. If we do not provide people with a place that they can feel that they're part of our community and look after them, they will turn to those forces. And that's something that I think is incumbent upon all of us to take from this, that we have that ability to look after everyone, especially those most vulnerable, to keep them on the right path and to ensure that we all go forward only serving and worshipping Hashem alone. Thank you very much.
To Rambam, all of us, where do we stand in the story of King Shaul and the Witch of Endor?
Oh, very good. The story of, for anyone who doesn't know, is that Shaul went to a witch and asked her to raise up Shmuel from the dead, and he does in the passage in Tanakh. She does raise up Shmuel from the dead, and they have a conversation kind of exists. So from the Rambam, it's very easy, right? The Rambam would say, "Yeah, there you go. That's a proof of it." The Rambam says, and he actually brings that as an example. He's talking about that. He says, "No, it was a trickery. It was some sort of magic trick where they had someone, maybe someone pretending to be Shmuel, whatever it was. It wasn't real." And he actually cites this as a seance again, wherever they sort of okay, they sort of bring this as an example. He brings this as an example. It says it in Tanakh, but it's just an example of trickery. The truth is, by the way, Rambam, his view probably works better for us ideologically, philosophically, easier to understand. Ramban's view works a lot better with the text. You don't have to squirm as much with the text. So
from the Torah mitzvah of putting the sorceress to death.
No, did not always follow the things he was supposed to follow, and that led to the end of his kingship and the end of his life. Not that particular time, but we know that he was.
Okay.
Rest.
Yes.
Is the sorcerer then okay?
No, I was thinking. I was thinking that there's really a sorceress. I think that is that sorceress witches were sort of more commonplace, whatever that means, as opposed to sorcerers. There's actually lots of historical eyes, more to do with sort of women, and particularly kind of old women who have themselves what we're talking about with these kind of powers too. Anyway.
That applies to the meeting in the open in a context.
That would fall under all these prohibitions, I'd say.
Great, thank you very much. That was very interesting. Thank you, Avi, for very interesting talk. Thank you to Carol doing the catering as usual. I will stop the record now. Say goodbye to those on Zoom. See you all next week. And I will just do the